The battle was already lost by the time Fleet Seer Omrath stopped pretending otherwise. She stood at the command bridge of the Vahari Reach and watched 3 more cruisers die on the tactical display. Not ships. She knew the names of their captains, the names of their children, in some cases. The vessels folded into light and debris, and then they were just numbers on a screen, and Omrath marked them the way you mark items on a list, with precision, with efficiency, with nothing left over for grief, because grief was a resource she had already spent. The gas giant Marith, 7 hung below them, massive and indifferent, its amber storms churning in slow, violent spirals that had nothing to do with the war being fought in its orbit. 400 ships. Against the Ascendancy's advance fleet of 3,000, the math was not complicated. It did not require a Fleet Seer's training to read. It required only the willingness to look at it and not look away. She did not look away. "Hull breach on deck 7 through 9, said Navigator Sevi, her voice flat and professional in the way of someone who had been flat and professional for 11 hours straight and had made it a point of pride. "Sealing now. We've lost 23 crew in that section." "Noted," Omrath said. What remained of the Vahari fleet held position at the orbital threshold, the agreed choke point, the place where 3 species had promised each other they would stand. The Thessid held the left flank. The Oron held the right. Both flanks had been bleeding for 6 hours. The Ascendancy didn't rush. That was the part Omrath found most insulting. They didn't need to. They advanced the way a tide advances, not in anger, not in hurry, but in the patient certainty of something that knows where the shore is and understands physics well enough not to worry about the outcome. Water doesn't hate the shore. It just arrives. She picked up her command stylus, set it down. On the tactical display, the Thessid Third Fleet was engaging an Ascendancy wedge formation 3,000 kilometers off the port side. The Thessid were good, fast ships, clever captains, a doctrine built on speed and repositioning, on being somewhere else before the fire arrived. She had fought beside them for 4 years. She knew their fleet commander's voice the way you know a colleague's breathing by its rhythm and its changes. She watched them fight. She watched. And she did not let herself watch too long, because there was nothing she could do with watching except carry it, and she was already carrying enough. Fleet Seer. It was Lieutenant Caravan, the youngest officer on the bridge, 26 years old, from an agricultural moon. He had a way of saying her title that made it sound like a question, like he was checking to see if she was still there, still standing, still the thing he needed her to be. "Should we attempt contact with?" "No," Omrath said. He understood. They had all understood for hours, but the young ones needed to ask. She didn't hold it against him. The Mutual Defense Accord had been signed 14 years ago, on a neutral station that no longer existed, destroyed in the Ascendancy's third expansion push. 42 species. One promise, carved above the entrance of the Coalition's primary assembly hall in 67 languages, repeated at every summit, broadcast to every new world that asked to join. An attack on any is an attack on all. 42 species. 23 had already fallen to the Ascendancy. 6 more were too far to reach this battle before it ended. 12 were watching from a careful distance and calling it neutrality, with expressions that couldn't quite hold the word without flinching. And Earth. "Any response from the Earth Embassy?" Omrath asked. Sevi didn't look up from her station. "No, Fleet Seer. Last confirmed contact with Earth's representatives was 9 days ago. The signal has been..." She stopped. The pause was not a technical problem. It was the pause of someone choosing words carefully in the presence of something uncomfortable. "There is no response." Omrath nodded. Lieutenant Caravan said nothing this time. He had learned faster than she expected. Through the main viewport, a Vahari cruiser tumbled past the Hessa's Promise. She recognized it by the distinctive blue markings on the forward hull, the color of deep ocean, the color they painted on every ship commissioned from the Vasi yards. The drive core was dark. The running lights were out. It moved on the slow trajectory of something that had become an object rather than a vessel, turning gently on its side, like a creature settling into sleep. She had attended the commissioning ceremony for that ship 11 years ago. She had danced at the captain's wedding the following spring. She had held that captain's daughter at her naming ceremony, a small, furious child who had grabbed Omrath's ceremonial hair braids with both fists and refused, absolutely refused, to let go. And everyone had laughed, and the captain had apologized, And Omrath had said don't, because it was the most alive she had felt in months. A tiny hand holding on for no reason, except stubbornness. She watched the Hessa's promise turn in the dark. She picked up her stylus, set it down. The Ascendancy's second wave is entering sensor range, Sevi said. ETA, to engagement distance, 40 minutes. Omrath closed her eyes, opened them. Full casualty report, all 3 fleets. Sevi compiled it in silence, sent it to Omrath's personal display. Omrath looked at the numbers. She had expected them to be bad. They were past bad. They were the kind of numbers that stop being numbers partway through, that become instead a weight, a temperature, a specific quality of silence you carry differently than you carry other silences. The Thessid Third Fleet designation showed at the bottom of the report. Current status, not responding. She looked at that for a long time. Then she called Vensura. The Thessid ambassador appeared on the secondary screen, looking like she had been awake for 2 days, running on something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite anything else. She was young by Thessid standards, which meant she was young by any standard. Sharp face, sharp eyes. The particular kind of angry that had been running so long it had settled into something that looked like a resting state but wasn't. The way a fire looks like embers right before it takes something. You saw the Third Fleet's status, Vensura said. Yes. Then you know what I'm about to say. You're not going to say it, Omrath said. Because saying it doesn't change the numbers. Vensura's jaw tightened. Something crossed her face that Omrath had no Vahari word for. You want to talk about the broadcast? Yes. A final record. The words came out flat and hard. So someone can find it in 100 years and feel bad. So that what happened here is preserved accurately, Omrath said. Someone else will fight this war after we are gone. They should know what we held, and for how long. Vensura was quiet for a moment. Outside the screen, behind her, Omrath could hear the noise of the Thessid command ship, the constant low sound of a vessel under sustained fire. The machinery of survival running at its limit. And you want the record to reflect that we asked for help, Vensura said. And it didn't come. Omrath said nothing. Fine, Vensura said. Call the other commanders. I'll be there. The meeting took place in what had been the Vahari Reach's war room. It was also, now, the field hospital overflow and the temporary housing for 63 survivors from the Marith Station evacuation, because rooms had stopped having single purposes somewhere around hour 4. Someone had moved the worst of the medical equipment to the walls. The survivors had arranged themselves with the careful politeness of people sharing space during something important, sitting against the bulkheads with their knees pulled up, watching with the patient eyes of people who had nothing left to do but witness. The 5 remaining senior commanders joined by screen. 3, Vahari, 1 Orin Commander Beltha, who had the quiet weight of a species that had faced extinction before and come out not exactly victorious but present, which in Beltha's experience was all victory ever really was. 1 Thessid Captain Veen, who had taken command of the Second Fleet 6 hours ago when her predecessor's ship had stopped being a ship. They went through the tactical picture. Nobody argued about the numbers. You don't argue with gravity. We have 2 functional options, Omrath said. Retreat or hold. Retreat to where? Captain Veen asked. The room was quiet. Then we hold, Beltha said. Her voice was the color of old stone. And we send the record. Caller. The record is a gesture, Vensura said. She had not sat down. She had positioned herself against the far wall with her arms folded and the energy of someone who was going to disagree with everything and help with all of it anyway. It is not a strategy. No, Omrath agreed. It isn't. But it is what we have. The debate about the broadcast content lasted 20 minutes. It should have taken 5. But people facing the end become particular about language in the way that only people with nothing left to lose can afford. Every commander wanted their species' contribution accurately represented. Every commander wanted the record to be fair, which meant different things to different people. And reconciling those differences took time that they were spending from a budget that was almost empty. In the end, they drafted something that said what happened, named every ship lost, named every species that stood at Marith 7, and stated clearly, and without self-pity, that a request had gone out for reinforcement under the terms of the accord, and that no reinforcement had arrived. Vensura read the final draft, read it a second time, said nothing for a moment, Then she took the document and added one line to the bottom. Omrath read the line. Looked at Vensura. Vensura met her eyes and did not apologize. Omrath left the line in. They sent the broadcast at the 40-minute mark, exactly as the Ascendancy's second wave settled into range. It went out on all channels, tight beam and widespread both, aimed at the Coalition's primary relay network, and at Earth's last confirmed coordinates, and at the open deep space frequencies that anyone with a receiver could catch. A record in 17 languages with full translation packets attached. What happened at Marith? 7. How long they held. How many were lost. Who stood. Who didn't. On the tactical display, the second wave arranged itself with the patience of something that had done this before and never found it interesting. They were organizing, taking position, not rushing. There was no rush necessary, and they knew it. Incoming fire, Sivi said. All stations brace. The Vahari Reach shook. Omrath held the edge of the command console. Her hands were perfectly steady. She was aware of this the way you are aware of your own heartbeat when someone points it out. The Oran fleet on the right flank took 2 heavy hits almost simultaneously. Commander Beltha's voice came through on the command channel, still steady, issuing orders to redistribute shield coverage to the damaged sectors. The Thessid Second Fleet was pulling a flanking move that was elegant by any measure, fast, precise. The kind of thing you only manage when the people flying those ships are very good and very angry and operating at the edge of what's possible. It wasn't going to be enough. Omrath knew that. Beltha knew it. Vensura knew it. They were all doing what they were doing anyway. Lieutenant Caravan was cycling through the long-range sensor feeds, his hands moving across the display with the automatic focus of someone who had run out of things to be afraid of and replaced the fear with pure function. He stopped. Fleetseer. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him all day. Deep-range telemetry is picking up an anomaly. Outer system marker. Close. Omrath crossed to his station. On the long-range display, buried in the noise of the battle's electromagnetic signature and the background radiation of the gas giant and the debris fields that had been accumulating for 11 hours, there was something. A field of objects, spread across a wide front, 14 hours out at the telemetry delay, which meant the signal she was reading now was 14 hours old. What she was seeing had already happened. The question was what it was. She studied the read. Objects moving in formation, except formation wasn't right because the spread was too wide, and the mass signatures were large, very large, and the vectors were wrong. Not drifting, not carried by the battle's wake or the gravity well's pull. Moving, with direction, with intention, against the current of the engagement, toward them. Get me a full analysis on those mass signatures, Omrath said, quietly. Sevi was already on it. She worked for 30 seconds, which was a long time for Sevi. I'm having trouble with classification, she said. The masses are. She stopped. Started again. They're large, Fleetseer. Individually large. And there are. She stopped again. Sevi. I am counting, Sevi said. And I'm going to tell you the number. And I want you to understand that I have checked it twice and I believe it is correct. She looked up from her display. It is not a small number. The Vahari Reach shook hard a direct hit, somewhere in the rear quarter. The whole ship groaning with it, the lights dipping briefly before coming back. Somewhere behind Omrath a piece of ceiling panel fell and someone swore. She was still looking at the long-range display. Objects moving against the current, toward them. A number that Sevi needed to qualify before she said it. Omrath did not think about hope. She had not budgeted for hope. She had budgeted for the record to go out and for them to hold as long as physics allowed, and for the next people who fought this war to know what happened at Marith. 7. She had not budgeted for a field of large objects moving against the current. The IFF transponders, Omrath said. Are they close enough for transponder read? Sevi checked. Checked again. At this range, the signal is 14 hours old, Fleetseer. Whatever I read from the transponders, it tells us what was there 14 hours ago. Not what. Read them. Sevi read them. She went very still. Fleetseer, she said, and her voice was flat again, professionally flat, but it was a different kind of flat now, the kind that is flat because it is working very hard to stay that way. I'm reading Earth Fleet IFF signatures. Multiple. She cleared her throat. I am reading many. Omrath looked at the display. The Vahari Reach shook again. She looked at the display. Lieutenant Caravan had gone completely silent. The bridge had gone a specific kind of quiet that was not the quiet of defeat, not the quiet of people saving their breath, but the quiet of people suddenly holding something they had not expected to be holding, and not knowing yet what it weighed. "How old is that signal?" Omrath asked. 14 hours. Then they are already closer than this. Sevi did not answer, because there was no answer to give. Omrath was correct. Whatever the telemetry was showing her, it was 14 hours behind the truth. The truth was somewhere closer, somewhere Omrath's sensors couldn't yet reach, somewhere moving through the dark with a heading and a speed, and a number that Sevi had needed to count twice. On the tactical display, the Ascendancy's second wave continued its advance. Patient, unhurried. Moving the way a tide moves, Omrath picked up her stylus. This time, she did not set it down. She began writing orders for a repositioning of what remained of the fleet, not a retreat, not a final charge, but a specific kind of patience, a holding pattern, a buying of minutes that she had not been buying an hour ago because she had not seen a reason to. She had a reason now. She did not say it out loud. She did not name it. She had been a fleet seer for 30 years, and she knew the cost of naming things too early. The way hope, spoken aloud, becomes a liability before it becomes a fact. But her hands were still steady on the console, and for the first time in 11 hours, she was not counting what remained. She was counting minutes. Vensura had stopped counting the dead somewhere around hour 7, not because the numbers stopped mattering. They mattered. Every number was a name, and every name was a ship, and every ship was full of people who had gotten up that morning and eaten breakfast, and argued with their crewmates about small, stupid things, and now they were debris. The numbers mattered enormously. She stopped counting because she only had so much of herself, and if she kept giving pieces of it to the numbers, there would be nothing left to do the work that still needed doing. So she stopped counting, and she kept working, and she told herself she would count again later, when later was a thing that existed. She stood at the back of the Vahari Reach's war room and watched Omrath run the joint commander meeting with the precision of someone who had already finished grieving and moved on to logistics. Vensura respected that. She did not share it. She was not built for that particular kind of calm. She was built for the other thing, the hot, efficient fury that kept your hands moving and your mind sharp and your mouth saying useful things even when every useful thing felt like screaming into a wall. The 5 commanders went through the numbers. The numbers were what they were. Nobody argued. 2 options, Omrath said. Retreat or hold. Retreat to where? Captain Van asked. Her voice was steady. Her second fleet had taken 30% casualties in the last 3 hours. Her voice was steady anyway. Nobody answered. Beltha said they should hold and send the record. Vensura said the record was a gesture. She meant it. She also knew she was going to help write it, because gestures were what you did when you had run out of everything else. And you did them anyway because the alternative was to do nothing. And she was Thessid, and Thessid did not do nothing. What exactly goes in this record? Captain Van asked. Everything, Omrath said. What we held, how long, how many we lost. The terms of the accord, and the nature of our request, and the nature of the non-response, Vensura said. Omrath looked at her. Yes, that too. Ven leaned forward on the screen. We name Earth specifically? The room went quiet in a particular way. Not uncomfortable. Exactly. More like the quiet of people standing around something they have been avoiding looking at directly, and someone has finally pointed at it, and now they all have to look. We name every party to the accord, Omrath said. We name who responded and who did not. The record is accurate or it is nothing. Tell. Nobody disagreed. Vensura noted that. 14 species on this call, more or less, and not one of them argued against naming Earth, because they were all thinking it. They had all been thinking it since hour 2, when it became clear that the Accord's promise was going to be tested in the most direct way possible, and the test was being failed, and the failure had an address. They started drafting. It took longer than it should have. It always does. The living are particular about how the dead get described, and every commander in that room was describing people they had served with, ships they had known, moments they had shared, and the difference between accurate and fair is smaller than people think, but still large enough to fight about. And they fought about it. carefully, with the tight, controlled energy of people who had no room left for wasted emotion. Vensura listened and occasionally said things and mostly watched. She was watching Omrath, specifically, the way the fleet seer moved through the meeting, steady, methodical, never rushed, never sharp in the way that meant something was breaking underneath. Vahari were old as species went, old and formal and precise. Their whole culture built around the idea that composure was not the absence of feeling but the management of it, the channeling of it into useful forms. Omrath was the best example of that Vensura had ever seen in person. It did not make Vensura feel better. It made her feel something else, something that wasn't quite envy, and wasn't quite admiration, and wasn't quite grief. Something that had all three of those in it and no clean name. She was still thinking about the Third Fleet. She was always thinking about the Third Fleet. The Third Fleet had been the best of the Thessid forces at Mareth. 7, fastest, most experienced, deepest in the engagement. They had been the ones pushing hardest into the Ascendancy's flank, the ones drawing fire away from the Vahari center, the ones buying hours with the particular economy of people who understand they are spending something they cannot get back. Not responding meant something specific. She knew what it meant. She had known for 2 hours what it meant. She had not said it out loud, and she was not going to say it out loud because saying it out loud would make it into the kind of thing you have to finish feeling, and she could not afford to finish feeling it right now. Later. She would do it later, when later existed. The debate wound down. The draft was finished. It was good, accurate, complete, stripped of anything dramatic or self-pitying, which was harder to achieve than it sounded because every sentence had been written by someone with something to be dramatic and self-pitying about. Omrath read it aloud once. Let it sit. Does anyone want to add or change anything? The commanders were quiet. Vensura took the document. Read it. Read it again. Her eyes moved down to the last line of formal closing. Properly diplomatic. Appropriately composed. She thought about the Third Fleet. She thought about the Accord. 14 years of meetings and summits and speeches. 67 languages. Carved in stone above a door that was supposed to mean something. She thought about the people who had signed it and shaken hands and believed they were building something real, something that would hold when it needed to hold. She thought about her captain's wedding ring on his hand in the morning briefings, the one she had teased him about because he always touched it when he was nervous, the small unconscious gesture of a man who had something to come home to. She thought about whether that ring was debris now. She added a line to the bottom of the document. Omrath read it. The fleet seer's expression did not change. Her eyes came up and found Vensura's. Vensura did not apologize. Omrath included the line. They sent it at the 40-minute mark. Vensura stood at a secondary console on the bridge of the Reach and watched the broadcast go out, a pulse of data, spreading in all directions at the speed that data traveled. 17 languages, full translation packets, a record of everything that had happened here. She watched the transmission confirmation on the screen and felt something she could not name close over her, like water over a stone. It was done. That part was done. Now there was only the other part. On the tactical display, the Ascendancy's second wave was settling into position. Organized, patient, taking their time. Because they had time. Because the math said they had all the time they needed. And the Ascendancy were very good at math. And they knew it. Vensura pulled up the deep-range intelligence package that had come in an hour ago, the one she had looked at and set aside because the tactical situation had needed her attention and the intel had not seemed immediately relevant. She looked at it again now. It was a standard long-range scan of known coalition member home systems, automated, ran on a cycle, whether anyone asked for it or not. The data was 14 hours old by the time it reached Mareth. 7. She found Earth section. She read it. She read it again. Earth's home system, intact. Not under attack. Not evacuated. Not the wreckage of something that had already fallen to the Ascendancy's advance. Intact. Active. And according to the energy signatures and the construction telemetry buried in the scan data, building, the signature of a shipyard running at full capacity was specific. You could read it in the energy output, in the materials processing emissions, in the communication traffic density around the construction sites. Vensura had grown up on a planet with 3 major shipyards, and she knew what the signature looked like. Earth's shipyards were running at a level she had never seen from any species data. They were not under attack. They were not retreating. They were not destroyed, or paralyzed, or caught in their own internal conflict. They were building. She stood at the console and looked at that data for a long time. There was a version of this that made sense, that Earth had simply decided not to come, that the accord was paper and the promise was air, and Earth had made the calculation that Marith, 7, was a cost they were not willing to pay. It happened. It had happened with 12 other species already. The careful retreat into neutrality, the mathematics of self-preservation. There was another version. She was not ready to think about the other version yet. The other version required her to think about scale and timing and the specific nature of what building meant when done at that level, and if she started pulling that thread, she would end up somewhere she could not come back from easily. She closed the intelligence package. She filed it where it needed to be filed. She went back to the tactical display and watched the Ascendancy's second wave finish its organization. They were not rushing. They were never rushing. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that compress in memory later into something much shorter, and stretch in the living of them into something much longer. Vensura moved between stations, ran analysis, relayed targeting data to the Thessid Second Fleet, argued twice with an Oran tactical officer about shield rotation sequences and was right both times, and drank something from a container she had found on a console that tasted like it had been made for a completely different species, but contained enough stimulant to keep her mind where it needed to be. The Coalition's lines held. Not comfortably, not well, but they held, in the way that something can hold when the people doing the holding have made a specific internal decision about how this ends for them, and that decision is made not from hope but from something harder and quieter, something you don't have a clean word for in most languages. The Ascendancy pushed. The Coalition pushed back. Ships died on both sides, but the exchange rate was wrong, always wrong. Always the Coalition paying more per hour than the Ascendancy, a slow bleed that had one ending, and everyone on both sides of the engagement knew what it was. Vensura ran the numbers in her head during a brief lull in the third hour. She ran them correctly. She put them away. Ladder. She was on the secondary bridge, a backup command space, lower on the ship, closer to the hull, where you could sometimes hear the sound of weapons impacts traveling through the metal, if the hit was close enough. When the sensor officer on duty sat up very straight, Vensura noticed. A sensor officer sitting up straight in the middle of a battle was a specific signal. "What is it?" she asked. The officer, young Vihari, the specific kind of compose that was holding by its fingernails, turned to her. "I'm reading something on deep range. Advisor. At the outer system marker. Classification? That's the issue." He looked back at his screen. "I can't classify it. The mass signatures are not matching anything in the catalog. The vectors are." He stopped. "They're moving against the battle current. Toward us." Vensura crossed to his station and looked. She was good at reading sensor data. 4 years of warfare had made her good at a lot of things she had not expected to need. She looked at the display and processed what she was seeing. Large objects. Very large. Moving with direction and purpose against the flow of the engagement. Which meant they were not debris. Not gas giant ejecta, not the secondary effects of anything that had happened in this battle. They were moving intentionally, with heading and speed. "How old is the signal?" she asked. 14 hours. Then they're already closer than this. Yes. She looked at the mass signatures, at the spread of the formation because it was a formation. She could see the structure in it, the arrangement, the deliberate geometry of ships that were placed where they were placed, on purpose. It was a very large formation. It was, she was beginning to understand, an enormous formation. The scale of it was not processing cleanly. She kept reading the numbers and her brain kept trying to correct them, kept flagging them as errors, because the numbers implied something that her experience told her could not be right. No fleet was that large. No species deployed forces on that scale to a single engagement. The resource cost alone would be, "I need IFF confirmation on those signatures," she said. The officer ran the check. The signal was 14 hours old, but the transponder codes were there, buried in the noise, readable if you knew where to look. He read them. He read them twice. He turned to Vensura. His face was doing something complicated, the Vihari equivalent of an expression she recognized from her own experience. The expression of someone who has received information that is too large to process quickly, and is simply holding it, while the processing catches up. Earth fleet signatures, he said. Multiple designations. UES prefix. I have. He counted. Counted again. I have. He stopped. Say the number, Vensura said. He said the number. She made him say it again. He said it again. Same number. His voice steady the second time in a way it had not been the first time. The way you get steadier when you've had a moment to hold something and find out it doesn't break you. Vensura stood at the station and looked at the display and let the number sit inside her and find its shape. A debris field. That was what it had looked like. Objects scattered across a wide front. She had looked at that red 20 minutes ago, and her brain had filed it as debris, because her brain had been working within a set of assumptions about what was possible and what was not. The assumptions were wrong. The objects were not debris. The objects were ships. And the number of them, the number this sensor officer had counted twice and was now holding with a steady voice and complicated eyes, was not a patrol, was not a reinforcement, was not the kind of number you sent to help. It was the kind of number you sent to end something. Vensura thought about the intelligence package she had read earlier. The shipyard signatures. The energy output. Earth building, at a scale she had never seen from any species. She thought about the timing, about when Earth would have had to leave their home system to arrive here with 14-hour-old telemetry, already placing them at the outer system marker. She thought about that timing very carefully. And then she understood something that sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it going outward into everything. They had left before the request went out. Earth had not received the Coalition's distress call and mobilized. The timeline made that impossible. They had been moving before any of this, before the Third Fleet fell, before Omrath sent the broadcast, before any official word of what was happening at Marith. 7 had reached anyone outside the system. They had left before they were asked. Vensura stood at the console and did not speak. She could hear the battle outside the hull, the distant thud of weapons, the groan of metal under stress, the ship working hard to stay alive. She could hear the sensor officer beside her breathing. She thought about the line she had added to the broadcast, the one that Omrath had left in without apology. She was not sure now how she felt about that line. She was not sure about a lot of things. What she was sure about was the number on the display, the fleet moving against the current, the ships that had been moving for long enough that they were already much closer than 14 hours away, already inside the outer system, already, if the speed vectors were right, already closing. She was sure about the timing. They left before they were asked. She did not say it out loud. She pressed it down into the place where she kept the other things she was holding for later, added it to the weight she was carrying, and turned back to the tactical display where the battle was still happening and still needed her to be useful. On the main screen, the Ascendancy's forces continued their advance, patient, unhurried, certain of their math. The thing about hope Omrath had learned over 30 years of war was that it had a cost, not the hope itself, the arrival of it. The moment it came back after you had already let it go, that was the expensive part, because letting go was a thing you did once, at great effort, and it settled into your body as a kind of stability, a terrible stability, the stability of a person who has stopped waiting for something and adjusted to its absence. And then hope arrived anyway, uninvited, and it broke that stability open. And suddenly you were unsteady in a way that was almost worse than the grief had been, because at least grief was something you knew how to carry. She was thinking about none of this consciously. She was thinking about the sensor data. The Vahari Reach had been in continuous combat for 13 hours by the time the long-range picture started to change. The ship was tired in the way that ships get tired, systems running hot, repair crews cycling through the same damaged sections over and over, because there was no time to fix things properly, only time to patch them well enough to hold another hour. The crew was tired in a deeper way, the kind of tired that gets into your hands and makes small tasks take longer than they should. Omrath was not tired, or she was tired in a way so deep it had looped back around to something that felt like ordinary wakefulness. She had been awake for 19 hours. She knew this the way she knew the current hull integrity percentages as data, recorded, filed. She stood at the main tactical display and ran the engagement. The coalition lines were thinner now. Not broken, they had not broken. Not yet. Not in 13 hours, which was something she would write in the record if she lived to write anything. But thinner. The Oran right flank had pulled back 200 kilometers over the last hour. Not retreating but compressing. drawing tighter, covering less space with what remained. The Thessid Second Fleet under Captain Veen was holding the left with a stubbornness that was remarkable and heartbreaking in equal measure. The Vahari Center held because Omrath was in it, and she had not given it permission to do otherwise. The ascendancy was still not rushing. She hated them for that, specifically for that, more than for anything else. The patience of it, the absolute confidence of a force that understood the math and trusted the math, and felt no need to hurry because the math was not going anywhere. Long-range sensor sweep updating, said HFY from her station. Her voice was back to its professional flatness. It had been flat and professional and steady for 13 hours, and Omrath intended to tell her, when this was over, that this was the finest piece of work she had ever witnessed, from any officer, on any bridge. Outer system marker is showing the anomaly is closer. How much closer? Significantly. Sevi worked at her console. The previous red placed them at the outer marker, 14 hours ago. The current red, she stopped, worked. They are moving very fast, Fleetseer. Show me. The display updated. Omrath looked at it. The field of objects had been spread wide in the earlier red a broad front, like a net cast across a large section of space. Now, with the closer red, the picture was different. Still wide, still a front, but the individual signatures were cleaner now, less like background noise, more like she searched for the right word, more like intent. Classification is still difficult, Sevi said carefully. The mass signatures they are larger than my catalog has good reference data for. I am cross-checking against all known fleet vessel classifications. She paused. I am not finding good matches. What is the closest match? Capital class, significantly above standard capital class. She paused again. Some signatures are reading larger than anything in the catalog. I believe I am reading them wrong. I am running the calculation again. Omrath waited. I am not reading them wrong, Sevi said. Her voice had not changed. It was still flat and professional, but it was a different kind of flat now, the flatness of someone pressing down on something with everything they had. Lieutenant Caravan had left his own station and moved 2 steps toward Sevi's without seeming to notice he was doing it. He was looking at her display from behind her. Omrath watched him look at it, watched his face. His face did something she would remember for a long time. IFF transponder read, Omrath said. Full sweep. Running. The bridge was quiet. Outside, always the constant the battle continued. Weapons hitting hull. Power systems compensating. The machinery of survival doing what it did. Inside, quiet. The transponder sweep took 40 seconds. When it came back, Sevi looked at it for a full 4 seconds, which was not how Sevi operated, which was not a thing Sevi did, because Sevi processed data and reported it and did not sit with it. 4 seconds was an enormous amount of time for Sevi to spend sitting with anything. Earth fleet designations, she said. UES prefix. Multiple vessels. She was reading down the list. Her voice was very flat. Very, very flat. UES inexorable. UES first principle. UES dawnbreaker. UES long memory. She kept reading. The names kept coming. UES we remember Dresden. UES reckoning. She stopped. The bridge was very quiet. Continue, Omrath said. The list is long, Fleetseer. Continue. Sevi continued. The names came out one at a time, each one landing in the silence of the bridge and sitting there. Not exploration names, not patrol vessel names, not the names of ships built for survey work or diplomatic transit, or the 100 other functions that fleets served in peacetime. War names. Every one of them. Named for what humans did when someone needed to be remembered, or something needed to be reckoned with, or a long memory was required. Named for the human habit of carrying their history with them into battle, stamped on the hull, broadcast on the transponder, in case anyone needed to know who they were dealing with. Omrath listened to the names. She picked up her stylus. She set it down. Her hands were still on the console. Perfectly still. Total count, she said. Sevi had been running the count. She had the number. She opened her mouth and said a number, and then she closed her mouth and checked it again, because the number was the kind of number you checked, the kind of number where you assumed you made a mistake somewhere, because numbers like that didn't present themselves in ordinary experience. She checked it. That count is correct? Omrath asked. Yes. Fleetseer. Lieutenant Caravan made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something hits them in the chest, and their body responds before their mind catches up with what just happened. He put his hand over his mouth and turned slightly away from the display and breathed. And then he turned back, and his eyes were bright, in a way that he was working very hard to manage. Omrath did not look at him. She looked at the display. The number was enormous. The number was... She could not think of a frame of reference that made it easy to hold. It was the kind of number that changed the shape of a battle, the way a geological event changes the shape of a landscape. It was the kind of number that, if you were on the wrong side of it, would do something to you that was not a tactical problem. It was the kind of number that was a message. On the secondary bridge, Vensura received the transponder confirmation at the same time, and through a different source, her own sensor officer, relaying from the Reach's sweep. She read the names on the screen. Read the count. She stood very still for a long moment. Then she went back to the timing. She had been circling the timing since she first looked at the intelligence package. Since she had understood, in a cold, clear way, that Earth's shipyards had been running at maximum capacity for how long. The energy signatures in the package didn't tell her when it started, only what it was at the moment of the scan. But the approach vector did. She had the distance. She had the speed. She had the current position. Working backward, she could calculate when this fleet had left Earth's home system, when they had crossed the boundary of Earth's own territory and pointed themselves at Marith. 7. She did the math. She did it again. The fleet had been moving for longer than the Coalition's distress broadcast had existed. Not hours longer. Days. Earth had been moving toward Marith, 7 before Omrath sent the record. Before Vensura added her line to the bottom of it. Before the Thessid Third Fleet fell and before the Oran right flank started compressing, and before any communication from this battle had reached anywhere outside this system. They had not received a call and responded. They had looked at something, the intelligence, the war map, the trajectory of the Ascendancy's advance. Something, and they had made a decision, without being asked. And the decision was, this fleet and this number and these names, and they had been moving for days. Vensura stood at her console. She thought about the line she had added to the broadcast, the one she had not apologized for, the one that said, clearly, and without diplomatic softening, exactly what she thought about promises that came apart when they were tested. She did not regret it. She also did not know, right now, what to do with it. She filed it in the place where she was keeping the other things she did not know what to do with yet, and she turned back to the tactical display, and she waited. On the main bridge, Omrath watched the Ascendancy. She had been watching the Ascendancy for 13 hours and she knew how they moved. She knew the rhythm of their formations, the geometry of their tactics, the pace at which they made decisions and executed them. They were not a fast-thinking force. They were a powerful one. They thought carefully, and they acted with certainty, and they did not change their plans, because the math supported the plans, and the math was sound. They were changing their plans. It was small at first. A shift in the Vanguard's formation, a tightening, a pulling back of the forward elements that had been pushing into the Vahari center. Not a retreat, a reassessment. The Ascendancy running new calculations. They've picked up the incoming fleet, Savi said. Yes, their long-range capability is at least as good as ours. Probably better. Sevi was quiet for a moment. They know the count. Yes. On the display, the Ascendancy's careful, patient, unhurried advance had developed a quality it had not had 10 minutes ago. It was subtle. You had to know what you were looking at. But Omrath had been watching them for 13 hours. She knew what she was looking at. The Tide had noticed something. The comms channel opened. It came in on a broad frequency, not targeted, not encrypted, not a private communication between commanders. Wide open. The kind of broadcast you made when you didn't care who heard you. When the content of the message was partly the fact of its transmission, the confidence of speaking loudly in a crowded room, Earth Fleet designation. Authenticated. The signal was strong now, much stronger than the 14-hour ghost they had been reading off the telemetry. Strong and clear, and close. The translation AI processed it in less than a second. English, to Vahari standard. Flagged for the bridge. Omrath read it. She read it again. 4 words. We've got it now. That was all. No tactical communication, no request for position data or damage reports or strategic coordination, no formal announcement, no ceremony. 4 words. We've got it now. Omrath stood at the command console of the Vahari Reach in the wreckage of a 13-hour battle, with hull breaches on 4 decks and 20% of her crew dead, and the tactical display still showing the Ascendancy's forces ahead of her, and she read 4 words on a screen. Her hands were on the console. They were not moving. They were, for the first time in 13 hours, completely still. Not because she had stopped working, not because there was nothing left to do, but because something had happened in her chest that was not grief, and was not relief, and was not joy, and was not any of the emotions she had words for. Something that was all of those and none of them, and too large to fit into any single name. The Ascendancy's vanguard had pulled back another 300 kilometers. The broad front of the Earth fleet was now visible on the main sensors, not a ghost, not a telemetry echo, but a real-time read. Ships, an enormous number of ships, moving fast. Moving with the specific geometry of something that knew exactly where it was going and had been knowing it for days. Lieutenant Caravan was crying, quietly, with his back to most of the bridge, his shoulders held carefully still, not making a sound. Omrath saw it, and did not say anything, and did not look away. She let him have it. Sevi was reading fleet identifications off the incoming signals with her flat professional voice, and the voice was flat and professional, in the way that things are flat. When the shape underneath them is something, the person is very carefully, not looking at directly. On the secondary channel, Commander Beltha of the Orun said something in her own language first, before the translation came through, something short and low, that Omrath's translation AI flagged as archaic form, possibly liturgical. The Orun prayed to dead stars. Omrath knew that. Ancient practice, largely ceremonial now, kept alive in moments of extremity. Beltha was praying to dead stars. The translation came through a moment later. We are still here. Vensura received the Earth Fleet transmission on the secondary bridge. Read it. Read it again. 4 words. She thought about what those 4 words cost. The resources. The planning. The decision-making chain that had to happen for a fleet this size to be authorized. Assembled. Launched. The calculation someone had made, not a fleet seer, but whoever Earth's equivalent, was looking at the war map and the trajectory of the Ascendancy's advance, and deciding, without being asked, to move. They left before they were asked. She kept coming back to that. The line she had added to the broadcast sat in her head. It was accurate. It had been accurate when she wrote it. Every word of it was still true. The accord had been tested, and the response had been what? Late? Early? The timing was too strange to fit into a clean narrative about failure or redemption. They had not come because the accord required it. They had come because they had already decided to come, before anyone told them they needed to. That was a different thing. She was not sure yet what kind of different thing it was. The question was too large for the moment. She pressed it down into the collection of large questions she was carrying and focused on the display, where the Ascendancy's once certain advance had developed a new and different quality. On the screen, the Earth fleet's approach vector was clean and fast and enormous, and aimed at the exact center of the Ascendancy's formation. Not flanking, not cautious, not the measured tactical approach of a force trying to minimize engagement costs. Straight in. Fast. Vensura looked at that vector for a long moment. She thought several things. She kept all of them to herself. On the main tactical display, the Ascendancy patient, certain, math-trusting, 13 hours unhurried, were moving faster now than she had seen them move in all of this engagement. But the Earth fleet was moving faster than that. Precision Commander Shreth had never lost a battle. This was not an accident. It was not luck. It was the result of 34 years of careful study, precise execution, and an absolute commitment to one principle that she had built her career on and taught to every officer who had ever served under her. The outcome of a battle is decided before the first shot is fired. Every engagement was a mathematical problem. You assessed your forces and the enemy's forces. You ran the variables positioning, speed, weapon range, shield capacity, crew quality, supply lines, the dozen other factors that fed into the calculation. You solved for the most probable outcome, and then you executed against that outcome with discipline and patience and the kind of steady nerve that came from trusting the numbers. The numbers had never been wrong. She stood at the command center of the Ascendancy, absolute flagship of the Marith. 7 engagement, 9 kilometers of the most advanced weapons platform her people had ever built. and she ran the numbers on the incoming fleet. She ran them correctly. She ran them 3 times to be certain. "The human fleet's approach vector is direct," said her tactical officer, Teth. He was young, precise, well-trained. No flanking maneuver. No attempt to split our formation. "They are coming straight at the center of our line." "I see it," Shreth said. "Their leading ships are already in our forward firing range." "I see that too." "Should I?" "Prepare the forward batteries," Shreth said. "Full volley. We welcome them where they have chosen to arrive." Teth moved to execute. Shreth looked at the numbers again. The human fleet was large. She had adjusted for that, fed the count into the calculation, rebalanced the variables, run the outcome again. The outcome had changed, not beyond recognition, but it had changed. The engagement would cost more than she had planned. The timeline would extend, but the conclusion was the same. The conclusion was always the same when the math was done correctly. She was certain of this. She would understand later. Exactly the wrong kind of certain. The first volley from the Ascendancy's forward line hit the leading human ships at full power. It was a good volley. Clean, disciplined, precisely timed across the full width of the formation. The way you hit an incoming force when you have range advantage and you intend to use it. The damage reports came back within seconds. Significant. Several human vessels destroyed. More damaged, some heavily. Shield systems on the leading ships reading critical levels. Shreth looked at the numbers, adjusted for the losses, ran the calculation. She waited for the humans to respond. They responded by going faster. She looked at the tactical display. The damaged ships, the ones with critical shields, the ones with visible hull damage, the ones that, by every doctrine of every spacefaring species she had ever fought, should be pulling back to a defensive position, while the undamaged ships covered them, were not pulling back. They were going faster. "Their damaged vessels are not retreating," Teth said. He said it. The way you say something, you can see clearly and understand completely, but that still refuses to feel real. "I see it. Their shields on the forward 3 cruisers are at..." "I see the readings, Teth." She looked at them. She understood what the readings said. The readings said that those ships were going to take the next volley with shields that could not adequately absorb it, and they were going to take it anyway, and they were going to keep going. She ran the calculation. This should not change the outcome. It should only change the cost specifically, the human cost, which was, by any rational measure, about to be enormous. You did not charge into a superior force with damaged shields, because the math on that scenario had one answer, and it was the kind of answer you did not come back from. "Second volley," she said. "Same targets. Finish the damaged ships before they close." The volley fired. The humans did not slow down. What she noticed first was the adjustments. The Ascendancy's tactical doctrine was excellent. It had been refined over centuries of warfare, tested against dozens of species, improved with every engagement. When an enemy did something unexpected, the doctrine had responses. When the responses were executed cleanly, the enemy's unexpected thing stopped being a problem and became just another variable to be managed. The humans did something unexpected. Shreth executed the response. The humans did something else. She executed the response to that. The humans adjusted. She looked at the timestamps on the exchange. The humans were adjusting faster than her doctrine allowed for. Not by a small amount. The gap between a human tactical shift and her counter-response was getting wider with each exchange, not smaller. She was always one step behind, and the step was growing. "Their formation is not behaving as a single tactical unit," Teth said, with the careful voice of someone reporting something they know will not be welcome. "It is behaving as many individual units, each making independent decisions, and the independent decisions are..." He stopped. "Are what?" "Complementary," he said. "They are each doing something different, and it is working together. I do not have a model for this. Shreth had a model for this. It was in the doctrine, under the section on uncoordinated enemies, forces that fought without central tactical authority, each unit doing its own thing, which typically resulted in an incoherent engagement that a disciplined force could dismantle methodically. The problem was that this was not incoherent. This was something else. Something that looked like incoherence from the outside and functioned like deep coordination from the inside. Except there was no central controller driving it. Each human ship was making its own decisions, and the decisions were fitting together the way a structure fits together. Not because someone had designed the structure in advance, but because the people building it understood the same principles and trusted each other completely, and the result was a thing that held together without being told to. She ran the calculation. The calculation was taking longer than it should. The variables kept changing. She ran it again. The human cruiser designated, she checked the transponder. She needed the name for the record. The UES Perseverance had taken more damage in the last 20 minutes than most ships survived. Its starboard engine cluster was gone. Its secondary shields were offline. It was listing, visibly, on the tactical display, a ship no longer flying cleanly but being pushed through space by what remained of its port engines. Asymmetrical, ugly, wrong. Shreth had assigned 2 Ascendancy destroyers to finish it. Standard protocol. A damaged ship was a liability to its fleet and an easy kill for hers, and clearing it from the board was clean tactical housekeeping. The Perseverance turned toward her lead dreadnought. She looked at the display. It was not moving away from the destroyers. It was not attempting the calculation that would tell it the best escape vector, the best angle to buy time, the best way to use its remaining speed to get out of the destroyer's firing arc. It was pointed at the Galactic, the largest ship in her forward line, 900,000 tons of Ascendancy capital ship, and it was going faster. That vessel is on a ramming vector, Teth said. His voice was perfectly level. The levelness of it was itself a kind of alarm. With its current speed and mass, impact would cause significant damage to... I see it. Should I redirect the Galactic to... Alert the Galactic to evasive, she said, and open a translation channel on their transmission frequency. They are broadcasting on open comms. Teth opened the channel. The translation, AI, began working. Shreth watched the Perseverance close the distance, still accelerating, still broadcasting. The translation came back in 11 seconds. She read it. She read it again. She turned to Teth. Is this correct? Teth looked at the translation. The AI is flagging 94% confidence. That is not what I asked. He read it again. I believe it is correct, Commander. Shreth looked at the translation. It was a joke, a specific kind of human joke, about the relative intelligence of someone who had started a fight with them. The translation. AI had struggled with the idiom and flagged several possible interpretations, but the core content was clear. The crew of the Perseverance, on a ship that was about to ram a dreadnought at terminal velocity, were on open comms telling each other a joke, not a last statement, not a declaration, not the kind of formal transmission that species sent when they were doing something they knew was the end. The ceremonial framing of a final act. Yoke. The Galactic had not completed its evasive maneuver in time. The impact registered on every screen, across the entire engagement. Shreth ran the calculation. She ran it carefully. She had all the data, the fleet count, the weapon outputs, the shield readings, the positioning, the human casualty rate so far, which was significant, genuinely significant. The humans were taking real losses. They were not invulnerable. They were not undamaged. They were bleeding as they advanced. They were bleeding, and they were advancing, and they were not adjusting their speed. She had fought species that were brave. She had fought species that were disciplined. She had fought species that had excellent tactics and well-built ships and clear-eyed commanders who executed under pressure with skill. She had measured all of those qualities in the calculation, and the calculation had held. The calculation did not have a variable for this. The variable was something she was trying to define and finding that her language did not have a clean word for it. She kept reaching for words, and they kept being wrong. Aggression was not right because aggression implied emotion, and this did not look like emotion. It looked like preference. Like the humans simply preferred this to the alternative, and the preference was so deeply settled that it did not look like a choice from the outside. It looked like a property. The way water is wet. The humans were this. Whatever this was. She looked at the Perseverance's last position on the display, already being cleared from the active board, already becoming a data point in the engagement record. She thought about the joke. She thought about the crew that had been telling each other a joke at the end, not because they were unaware it was the end, but, she suspected, precisely because they were. She thought about what that meant, what it said about the calculation that she could not complete. Her doctrine assumed, as its foundation, that every species would optimize for its own survival when survival was possible. The entire structure of ascendancy tactics was built on that assumption, because it was true. It had always been true. Every species Shreth had ever fought, when facing overwhelming odds, made the same final calculation, the one that led to retreat, or surrender, or the measured sacrifice of a portion to save the whole. The humans were not making that calculation. They were making a different calculation that she could not read from the outside, and the results of it kept producing outcomes her doctrine did not have responses for. Commander, Teth's voice was careful, very careful. The human fleet's center advance is now at, I see the position. Our second line is taking heavy pressure. If they maintain that advance vector, I know what happens if they maintain the advance vector, Teth. She looked at the display. The center of the Ascendancy's formation, the strongest part of it, the place where the largest ships sat behind the forward screen, the place that by any proper calculation was supposed to be safe because nothing broke through to the center of a formation this size. Nothing, not in any engagement she had run in 34 years, was under direct pressure. Not from the sides. Not from a flanking action she had failed to anticipate. From the front, the humans had gone straight in. No flanking, no misdirection, no attempt to find the weak point in the formation and exploit it. They had looked at the center of the strongest fleet she had ever commanded, and they had gone straight at it with everything they had, and the straight line had not stopped, and it had not slowed, and it was not stopping now. They should not be able to do this, Teth said. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to the display, to the numbers that were not producing the expected answer. The frustration of a well-trained mind meeting a problem it has the wrong tools for. No, Shreth agreed. They should not. She ran the calculation one more time. The calculation gave her an answer. She looked at the answer for a long time. The center line broke at the 2-hour mark. Not in the tactical sense, not all at once. Not cleanly. Not the way a formation breaks when it is outmaneuvered or overwhelmed by force. It broke in a different way first. In the way that things break when the people inside them are no longer certain of something they need to be certain of to function. The Ascendancy's forward ships had been in continuous combat with the human fleet for 2 hours. They had taken losses. That was expected. They had been outmaneuvered in ways that were not expected. They had watched the Perseverance ram the Rathic Voss and heard the translation of the open channel broadcast and processed the information that the crew had been telling each other a joke. They were still processing it. The math had always held. The math was the foundation. You did the math and you trusted the math, and the math told you what was going to happen next, and knowing what was going to happen next meant you were not afraid, because fear was the gap between what you expected and what arrived. And if you expected correctly, there was no gap. The humans kept arriving in ways the math had not predicted. The gap kept opening. Shreth saw it happen across her command screens, the small hesitations, the fractional delays in response times, the forward ships pulling back half a second later than the order required, because the humans had done something else. Something new. Something the doctrine did not have a name for, and the officers in those ships were spending a moment that they could not afford trying to understand it before they reacted to it. Fractional delays. Half seconds. Quarter seconds. At the scale of a fleet engagement, those fractions were the difference between a line that held and a line that didn't. We are losing the center, Teth said. Yes. Your orders, Commander? Shreth looked at her screen. She looked at the human fleet, pressing forward, taking losses, still pressing. The gap between their casualties and their advance not behaving the way the calculation said it should. She looked at the Rathic Voss, damaged and out of position. She looked at the coalition fleet, smaller, battered, outgunned before the humans arrived, still on the field. Still there. Still holding because someone had told it to hold, and it had decided to believe that instruction for reasons she now understood better than she had 13 hours ago. She looked at all of it. She thought about the joke. Order the forward line to pull back to secondary positions, she said. Consolidate around the heavy ships. We will hold at the secondary line and reassess. Teth understood what reassess meant. The word meant something in Ascendancy doctrine. It was the word you used when the calculation had produced an unexpected outcome, and you needed time to run it again with better data. He began issuing the orders. On the display, the Ascendancy's center pulled back. The human fleet followed. Not in the cautious way of an advance that wants to hold its gains. In the way of something that had been going this direction for a long time and did not see a reason to stop. From the Vahari Reach, Omrath watched the ascendancy pull back. She watched it with the careful stillness of someone who does not trust a thing yet, who has been in enough battles to know that the moment you let yourself feel something is often the moment you stop paying attention, and stopping attention is how you die. She watched every movement, noted every position, tracked the human fleet's advance with the precision of a commander who was still working, still thinking, still running the engagement even though the engagement had changed. She was aware, in a distant way, that her hands were shaking. Not much. Not visibly. Probably. To anyone watching from a distance. Just slightly. At the fingertips. The small involuntary tremor of a body that had been running at its absolute limit for 15 hours and was now processing something for which it had not budgeted. She pressed her hands flat against the console. They steadied. On the display, the human fleet named U.S. We Remember Dresden turned into the exposed flank of the Ascendancy's retreating second line and hit it with everything it had. It was, Omrath thought, watching the tactical display, a very clean piece of work. She noted it, filed it, kept watching. The battle ended the way most battles ended, not cleanly, not all at once, but in pieces, the way a fire goes out, one section at a time, until you look up and realize the light has changed. The Ascendancy's rear guard held for 6 hours after the center broke. They were disciplined. Shreth, wherever she was on that flagship, was running her calculations still, finding the line that did not exist, the position that would let the math work again. She bought 6 hours. That was not nothing. Omrath noted it in the record with the precision she gave everything, including the fact that the retreat, when it finally became a retreat, was executed with more order than she had expected. The Ascendancy were not broken. They were recalculating. That was a problem for another day. This day had its own weight. The human fleet pushed the Ascendancy's rear guard out to the system's edge, and then held there, not pursuing beyond the boundary, not overextending, just standing at the threshold in a way that communicated something without needing to say it. Omrath watched that decision and noted it too. Discipline, after a victory, was harder than discipline in a fight. The humans had it. She began the damage assessments. She began the casualty counts. She let herself count again, now that later was a thing that existed. The Vahari Reach had taken 41% hull damage across the engagement. 12 of its decks were partially or fully compromised. Its starboard weapons array was gone. It had lost. She looked at the number, held it, placed it in the record. 214 crew. Names. All of them with names. She would read every one before she slept. If she slept. The coalition's total losses across all three fleets were staggering, not annihilating. They had held. They had not broken. The line had not been lost, but staggering in the way of a number that you know will take a long time to fully understand. The way that some weights you don't feel immediately but find later. In the body. In the weeks that follow. In the quiet moments when the work stops. She filed the numbers. She began the organizational work of a fleet that had survived something enormous and now needed to function again. Supply chains, repair priorities, medical resource distribution, the 100 other tasks that follow a battle and are just as important as the battle and receive far less ceremony. It was 3 hours after the Ascendancy's departure that the request came from the Earth Fleet Command. Formal, properly structured. A request to send a representative aboard the Vahari Reach for the standard post-engagement coordination meeting between Allied commanders. The kind of communication that followed joint operations, the administrative layer that turned a battle into a record, and a record into a foundation for whatever came next. Omrath read the request. She authorized it. She stood at the viewport of the Reach's main observation deck for a few minutes afterward and looked at the battle debris still drifting in Mareth, 7's orbit. The gas giant's storms were unchanged, still churning, still indifferent. The amber spirals had watched 15 hours of war and found it unremarkable. She understood that feeling more than she would have admitted. She went to prepare for the meeting. She had formed an image of what the human admiral would look like. She was not aware she had done this until the admiral came through the docking corridor, and the image and the reality met each other and produced a small internal friction that Omrath noticed in the way you notice. A step that is slightly lower than you expected, the body's automatic adjustment. The recalibration. She had expected, without quite deciding to, someone large. Someone with the specific physical quality that power tends to produce in the people who carry it, the expanded presence, the deliberate bearing, the visible weight of authority worn as a kind of armor. She had met commanders like that from a dozen species. They tended to come in a recognizable shape. Admiral Yara Vasquez was not large. She was an ordinary human height, which Omrath had learned was a range rather than a fixed point, and Vasquez occupied the middle of that range without distinction. She had the kind of face that had been formed by long exposure to difficult things and had not softened under that exposure, but had not hardened. Either had instead arrived at something else, something that was neither soft nor hard, that was just present in the way of something that has been tested and found out what it is made of, and is no longer surprised by itself. She was tired, not in the way of someone who needed sleep, though that was probably also true. In the deeper way, the way of someone who has been tired for so long that the tiredness has become part of the structure of the person, has knit itself into the daily operation of their body, has been incorporated. The way scar tissue is incorporated, you stop noticing it separately from yourself, because it has become yourself. Omrath recognized that tiredness. She saw it in her own mirror. Vasquez stepped into the meeting room, still the war room, still smelling of antiseptic and burned metal. The survivors from Marath Station having been moved to proper quarters some hours ago, and looked at the space with eyes that processed it quickly, took in what mattered, filed the rest. She looked at Omrath. "Fleetseer Omrath," she said. Her Vahari standard was being translated through the room's system, but the translator was good enough to carry tone, and the tone was direct, plain, not ceremonial. "Admiral Vasquez," Omrath said. "Please, sit." They sat. Vensura was in the room. She had inserted herself into it without asking, which was very Vensura, and Omrath had not stopped her, because Vensura had earned the right to be in any room she chose to stand in today. Commander Beltha of the Oran was on screen. Captain Ven. The surviving senior commanders of the Coalition's Marath. 7 engagement. The administrative business was handled first. Vasquez's tactical officer, a compact, efficient man named Reyes, went through the engagement summary, the handover of battle space control, the coordination protocols for the cleanup operation, and the ongoing watch at the system boundary. Omrath's people responded with the equivalent data. It was precise, professional work, and it took 40 minutes, and it was necessary. When it was done, the room had a different quality. The work had been the armor. Now the armor was set aside. Omrath looked at Vasquez. She had been composing the question for several hours. Not the words were simple. The composition was of something underneath the words, the precise calibration of what she was actually asking versus what the words literally said. She had decided, in the end, not to calibrate, to ask it plainly. "I have a question," she said. "It is not a tactical question." "Ask it," Vasquez said. "Why did you come?" Omrath said. "The Accord did not require it. Not at this scale. Not unprompted. You were not asked and you came anyway. I need to understand why." The room was quiet. Vasquez looked at her. Whatever was behind her eyes in that moment, Omrath's translation AI flagged as expression. Unclassifiable cross-referencing. It kept cross-referencing. It did not resolve. Vasquez said something, 2 sentences, brief. The translation came through clean. "Because you were here." That was enough. Omrath sat with that. "Because you were here." That was enough. 4 words the first time, 5 words the second time, 9 words total, for a question that had been building for 15 hours and would take considerably longer to fully answer. She did not ask for more. The instruction was in the answer itself. There was no more. That was the whole of it. The entire foundation of the decision, stated without decoration, "Because you were here." That was enough. Vensura, standing against the wall in her chosen position of controlled distance from everything, said nothing. Omrath glanced at her. Vensura's jaw was set in a specific way. Her arms were crossed. She was looking at the wall somewhere to the left of the screen where Beltha's face was. Vensura, who had an opinion about everything, who had added an unauthorized line to a final broadcast and not apologized for it and never would, who ran on fury the way some ships ran on fuel, was not saying anything. That told Amreth more than the words had. The meeting wound down. The formal portions completed, the records filed, the next steps agreed. Vasquez stood to leave with the compact efficiency of someone who had more things waiting and had rationed her time here accordingly. She paused at the door. Your people held this system for 15 hours, she said. Against that force. With what you had. She said it in the way you say something that is simply true, without addition or emphasis. That goes in our record too. She left. Amreth stood in the empty meeting room for a moment. Vensura came to stand beside her, not speaking, just beside her, which was its own kind of communication, from a person who communicated mostly in argument and friction and the occasional unauthorized editorial addition. They stood there together for a moment. You're not going to say it, Amreth said. No, Vensura said. The line you added to the broadcast is still accurate, Vensura said. Everything in it is still true. The accord was tested. The response was not what the accord promised. She paused. It was something else. It was not the thing that was promised. It was a different thing. A larger thing, Amreth said. Vensura was quiet for a moment. I don't know what it was yet, she said. I don't have the word for it. She uncrossed her arms. Let them fall to her sides. I'll find the word eventually. She left. Amreth stayed. She went to the observation deck eventually, because she needed to think, and she thought best with Mareth. Seven's amber storms below her, and the debris of the battle still drifting and the strange new shape of the system around her, the coalition's battered fleet, and the enormous presence of the Earth vessels, and the strange, ordinary miracle of a thing that had happened today. There was a viewport section on the lower level of the deck, close to the hull, where you could see across to the external repair work being done on the Reach's damaged sections. 3 teams out there, moving along the hull in their magnetic suits, working on the starboard weapon array and the 2 worst hull breaches. Standard post-battle repair operation. One of the teams had a human on it. 2. She corrected herself, looking more carefully. 2 humans, working alongside 4 Vahari engineers with the particular focused energy of people who are solving a specific problem together and have gotten past the phase where they needed a shared language to do it, communicating instead in the universal language of pointing at damaged things and gesturing and occasionally just physically demonstrating what you meant. One of the humans young, she thought, though she found human age difficult to read, had brought something. A container of some kind, silver, rounded, attached to their suit's utility belt. As she watched, the human unclipped it, opened it, and offered it around the group. The Vahari engineers looked at the container. The human gestured at it encouragingly. One of the engineers accepted whatever was inside. The human looked pleased in the uncomplicated way of someone who has successfully shared something they like and wants others to like it too. Amreth watched this. The container was passed around. The human watched everyone try it with the specific, hopeful expression of a person waiting to see if the thing they like will land. One engineer's body language shifted in a way that suggested the contents were acceptable. Another's suggested mild uncertainty. The human pointed at the uncertain one and made a gesture that the translation AI, working on body language rather than speech, suggested might mean, give it a second. The uncertain engineer waited. The uncertain engineer tried again. Their posture shifted. The human pointed at them, in the satisfied way of someone who knew this would happen. Amreth watched the whole exchange. The container was coffee. She knew this because she had been briefed on human stimulant preferences in her initial coalition orientation 14 years ago, and the shape of the container was consistent with what she had seen in reference materials. Coffee, a drink humans made from a specific plant that grew on Earth, roasted and ground and processed in various ways, consumed in large quantities, apparently central to human functioning in the way that certain nutrient compounds were central to Vahari functioning but treated less like fuel and more like a ritual, a social object, a thing you offered people when you wanted to be near them. They had brought coffee to the hull repair. The crew of the Perseverance had told each other a joke. Admiral Vasquez had the eyes of someone who had been tired for a very long time and had incorporated the tiredness and kept going. Because you were here. That was enough. Something moved through Amreth that she needed a moment to identify, because it was unexpected, and she had not budgeted for it, and it did not fit into any of the categories she had been working in for the last 17 hours. It was fear, not the fear of losing. She knew that fear. It was an old, familiar thing, well-worn, manageable. Not the fear of the ascendancy, or of the battle, or of the numbers on the casualty report. This was a different kind. The kind that had nothing to do with threat in the direct sense. The kind that came from understanding something and not knowing what to do with the understanding. She was afraid of the coffee, of the joke, of the tired eyes and the two sentences and the complete absence of ceremony around an act that should have had ceremony, that by any measure of any species culture should have been marked with something, speeches, declarations, the formal weight of what it meant to cross the distance they had crossed and do the thing they had done. Nothing. Just arriving. Just, we've got it now, and coffee on the hull. She was afraid of what it meant to be the same species as the Perseverance's crew, and also the species that brought coffee to share with people you had never met, because you were fixing something, and fixing things was better with coffee. The same species. One thing. She thought about what that meant for a galaxy that had spent 1,000 years cataloging its dangers, measuring its threats, building its doctrines around the known shapes of what could hurt you. The ascendancy, the various other forces that had risen and fallen and been recorded and responded to and managed. The galaxy had been doing that accounting for a very long time. It had not, as far as she knew, made a line item for something that made war the way the Perseverance's crew made war, and also brought coffee to hull repairs, and waited with hopeful eyes to see if the Vahari engineers would like it. Something that was not trying to be dangerous and was not trying to be kind. Something that was just being what it was, completely, without adjustment, without performance, bringing all of it everywhere it went. On the hull, the human with the coffee had gone back to work. The repair team moved along the damaged section of the starboard array in a coordinated way. Human and Vahari together, working with the focused ease of people who have found the shared rhythm of a task and are now simply inside it. The uncertain engineer reached over and tapped the human on the shoulder, pointed at the coffee container. The human unclipped it immediately, passed it over without hesitation, did not make a thing of it. Umreth watched. She thought about the question she had asked and the 9 words she had received. Because you were here. That was enough. She thought about Vensura's line in the broadcast. Still accurate, Vensura had said. A different thing. Yes. A different thing. She did not yet know what to do with a different thing of this size. She suspected it would take time, not hours. Not the kind of time you measured in tactical cycles, but the other kind. The long, slow kind that changed the shape of things without you noticing until you looked back and could not find the original shape anymore. She would write the record of today with the same precision she brought to everything. She would write what the coalition held, and for how long, and what it cost, and what arrived. She would write Vasquez's 2 sentences. She would not write what she was thinking now, standing at the viewport with Marith, 7's amber storms below her, and a human sharing coffee on her hull. That was not the kind of thing that went in a tactical record. That was the kind of thing that lived in the space between records, in the silence that held the weight of what had happened when the words ran out. She stood at the viewport for a while longer. The galaxy had spent 1,000 years cataloging its dangers. It had not thought to account for the ones that hadn't decided yet whether to be dangerous. It would need a new category. She turned from the viewport and went back to work.